The two new historic wreck discoveries that I'm going to be talking about have just been designated under the Protection of Wrecks Act 1973 by the UK government, acting on the advice of Historic England, after having had to ride out the pandemic under a cloud of confidentiality. I'll be talking more about why they had to remain confidential despite being discovered in 2018 later. Now, most of the historic wrecks that we have been involved in, certainly I have been involved in investigating for Historic England over the years, inevitably have tales of, there's no other way to say it, tales of death and destruction associated with them. Indeed, it could be said that historic shipwrecks are an archaeology of death and destruction. However, the account I'm going to give this lunchtime involves not just victims, but also three local heroes who are most definitely not historic. Firstly, there are Martin Pritchard and Dave Fox, local Isle of Wight divers and wreck investigators, whose voluntary work led to the discovery of the sites and who will now lead their future investigation as licensees. Secondly, there's my professional colleague, Julie Satchell, of our professional partners in this investigation, the Maritime Archaeology Trust. Her local work in building contacts with local divers helped ensure the reporting of these sites to Historic England, and therefore Wessex Archaeology's subsequent involvement and the designation. And she will act as a future archaeological advisor to Martin and Dave. So after those acknowledgements, let's get back to the good old death and destruction, and the first of our two new sites, which has the less than dashing title of NW96. You can see the site position here is on Shingles Bank, just outside the mouth of the Solent and north of the iconic Needles, which are down here if you can see my pointer. On the right-hand side, you can see multi-beam bathymetry image, which shows the depth, with the cooler colors representing the deeper parts of the seabed, the lighter, the shallower parts, and the cluster of targets is the site. You can see it's very close to the navigation channel, which takes large vessels out and into the Solent from the west. Now, Martin and Dave discovered the site in 2018 using a vessel-mounted side-scan sonar. For those of you not familiar with that, it's a piece of equipment that sends out pulses of sound, and they reflect back off objects that are upstanding from the seabed, and the software assembles it into an image such as you can see, which is effectively an image of reflections. This is the sonar image that Martin and Dave presented to us when we were called in 2020 by Historic England to provide advice on the site and to provide evidence about its importance after Martin and Dave had gone to Historic England to report the discovery. By diving the site, Martin and Dave didn't find the wooden remains of the ship, but they did establish that most of the obvious linear objects that you can see here and here and here and here, etc., were perhaps 50 very large lead ingots lying on or partially buried in the shingle seabed. That, surprise, surprise, characterizes Shingles Bank. They were packed into a roughly rectangular area, which you can see covering very approximately 15 by 5 meters, although you can see that there are several outlying anomalies up to 10 meters away that may or may not be associated with the site, although it'd be quite coincidental if they weren't. Such a quantity of ingots can really have only one plausible explanation: a shipwreck. and the bank is sufficiently shallow at this location, just a few meters, for a ship to have gone aground. Now, no evidence of the vessel itself has been found, probably due to the destructive combination of age, exposure to winter storms in such a shallow location, biofouling, and the hard, mobile, gravelly seabed. What I mean by biofouling is basically things that will eat and degrade wood. Most of the ingots are lying flat and are partially buried. 2 have been measured and are between 1.47 and 1.37 meters long and between 0.36 and 0.42 meters wide. And now, if you don't know anything about lead ingots, take it from me that that is very large. And they appear to be of what's called the open cast type, possibly using the bowl process as what's called piglets in a sow and piglet mold, with one shallow boat-shaped, in other words, curved side, and one flat side. Now, some of them have holes or cuts for lifting. You can see them there. That's a hole and that's a cut in the side, and there's one over on the other side, I believe, but it's obscured by the shingle. And they're important because handling ingots of this size and weight would otherwise be very difficult. I've recovered ingots myself from various sites, including one in the Shetlands, and they weigh, you underestimate them at your peril, and if you don't handle them correctly, people get hurt. Some are upended. You can see this one is upended here with part of it down here is buried in the shingle. This one shows clear evidence for the high mobility and indeed the aggression or the potential aggression of surface deposits of gravel and cobbles, which that you can see they created a polished, eroded surface on the ingot. Some of them have impressed marks, and one has a number of cross-like markings within an impressed square. Another has a distinctive impressed 4 lines and oval impressions. And another, this one on the top left, has a plus and sort of Roman 3. And all were probably created with a specialist tool or stamp. You can see they're quite complicated in their form. Now, a fairly comprehensive search of ingot stamps recovered from wrecks in both the UK and Western Europe has been undertaken, and no direct parallels have been found for these markings. Stamps like this could have been applied at a number of stages in the life of these ingots. They may have been applied post-manufacturing or by merchants whose hands the ingots pass through. The use of different marks or the presence of different marks does suggest more than one place of manufacture and or that they have passed through a chain of custody. Now, the shape of and therefore the manufacturing methods of the lead ingots have produced our first real dating evidence for this site. Although the archaeological evidence from various wrecks suggests that these so-called great pigs, very large ingots, as opposed to smaller little pigs or pieces, they were also called, continued to be cast in the 17th century, the bowl tends to be associated with pre-1580 production. Now, in addition to several linear concretions form around ferrous objects that rust away and gather up sand and gravels, etc. Linear concretions that may be early iron cannons. You'll have to take it from me that this is a low resolution video still that you can see shows what could be a very small iron cannon. At least 12 large stone cannonballs have been found. Two have been recovered. You can see one of them here, and have a diameter of 172 millimeters or 6.77 inches in old money. So they've not been carved for small guns. We think the site is too far away from the shore for these to have been fired from coastal batteries, although at this stage in the site's investigation, we cannot entirely rule out the possibility that their presence may be coincidental and not linked to the wreck, in other words, fired by another ship at a different time. Presence of these stone cannonballs also provides us with our second piece of dating evidence, because stone shot gradually fell out of use during the late 16th century, being replaced by the iron cannonballs that are now so familiar from historic wreck sites. Whilst like bowls, stone cannonballs survived beyond the 16th century, the balance of probability is that NW96, this wreck, is the wreck of a ship lost before the end of the century and probably before 1580. And the large number of ingots present and the size of the cannonballs, assuming they were there for the ship's own guns, of course, suggests a large ship. The date indicates, obviously, that it would have been a wooden sailing ship. It's therefore likely that the site is the wreck of a large armed and currently unidentified merchant ship of the 16th and possibly even very late 15th century. The lead ingots were almost certainly functioning as the ship's ballast, as well as being carried as a major part of its cargo. So how important is this discovery? How important is this site? And can we say more at this early stage in the site's investigation about what the ship was doing there at the mouth of the Solent in the 16th century? Just how important is the fact that this ship was carrying lead as a cargo? Well, England was for a long period a very important lead producing and exporting country. You will see this anonymous 16th century verse in which the commodities of wool, tin and lead are clearly regarded as being the most important that England produced. And sites associated with the lead industry are estimated to number the really rather remarkable total of about 10,000, which about 250 are thought to be of national importance. So the lead industry, in terms of the heritage of England, is quite a big deal. But despite this, the archaeological evidence for the movement of lead once it's been produced and smelted to distribution centres and markets, particularly at sea, is fairly poorly understood from an archaeological perspective. And indeed, the current research framework for the industry concentrates on very much on lead production and smelting sites. Now, a scoping study carried out to support the investigation identified a total of 55 losses of ships carrying lead cargo recorded by historic England for the period 1399 to 1800 in the territorial waters surrounding England. Of course, there may be more further out. You can see here that if the loss dates are broken down by century, there's a clear bias towards the 18th century, which reflects the growth of intensive, large-scale lead deposit exploitation, in other words, mining, as well as better reporting of marine casualties, in other words, shipwrecks. And really for the earlier periods, the records are pretty sparse. Distribution can be seen here, and I would ask you to bear in mind the study is limited to territorial waters, although historically most losses are really probably likely to have occurred along the coast. Now, approximately 3/4 of the losses departed from English ports, the remaining quarter from foreign ports, although they may still have been carrying lead that originated from England. Losses can be seen clustered along the south coast, will include strays or vessels travelling through the English Channel that had the misfortune to be caught in a storm and blown onto the coast and wrecked by force of weather. Now, these may or may not, as I've said, have been carrying English lead, But ports in the Netherlands, which were closely involved in transporting the commodity in the English Channel, traded a great deal of it, particularly to the markets in the Far East. And of course, you'll remember the Dutch East India Company. There's an obvious concentration on the East Coast, reflecting the fact that East Coast ports could be accessed from where most of production was. Most of it was in the north of England. The Port of London, however, retained an importance throughout the period and enjoyed a virtual monopoly of lead exports for much of the time. Much lead was carried coastally to London before being exported through it or its outports. So what does that mean for NW96? Well, we have this document, and the background really is that in 1492, Henry VII, not a king, I understand, to do a favour that had not been paid for, granted Southampton a monopoly of the valuable lead export trade in return for the past support of its burghers. And this event leads us to some very interesting speculation. I must stress it is speculation about the identity of NW96. Now, lead had to be exported from Southampton or its outports, and lead can be expected to be moved coastwise and also for export through the Solent and therefore potentially past the site. In the late 15th century in particular, the numerous Italian merchants present in the city appear to have had an important role. Now, whilst London merchants eventually took over and the monopoly expired in 1531, the city became a London outport in respect of lead, and Italians seem to have continued to be involved in lead exports from the city. Trade in lead was initially stimulated by Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. Obviously, they had a great deal of lead on their roofs. But the flooding of the market that this caused actually subsequently led to a pretty severe downturn in the trade. And that's where this document comes in, because it provides some context for in that it is a legal document relating to evidence, and it's in effect a witness statement. And a lawsuit heard before the Admiralty Court in 1547 or 1548, depending on its old or new dates, brought against the salver by a consortium of Venetian merchants about the salvage of the ship, the St. Mary and St. Edward in the Solent area, not unfortunately our wreck, because it's too far, because our wreck is too far from Southampton to match the historic accounts. Heard from the salver's diver, and I should explain that the salver had an agreement with the Venetian merchants to salvage their ship. He heard from the salver's diver, Jacques Francis, that the lead salvaged and sold by the salver was not from the merchant ship, but from another vessel he had helped salvage the year before from near the Needles. Obviously, the merchants were thinking that the lead had come from their ship and the salver was diddling them. So could this reference in the evidence of the diver Jacques Francis be a reference to NW96? Well, I'm sorry to say that we simply don't know at this stage, but the connection is possible. It's got the correct date range, and the stone shot to which have been recovered is not English shot such as Kentish ragstone, which might have been expected, but an unidentified stone, and therefore possibly a foreign ship. So putting 2 and 2 together, and at the risk of quite possibly getting 8, do we have a Venetian or Italian or other Italian merchant ship exporting English lead from Southampton? We don't know, but we do at least have a theory to work on. Now, interestingly, Jacques Francis is described as being from Guinea, which is the traditional name for the West African coast, which lies along the Gulf of Guinea. So Jacques seems to have been, dare I use the term, one of the black Tudors that we are becoming increasingly told of and aware of. And on that note, let us move on to Martin and Dave's second discovery with a name, oh, excuse me, also to conjure stories with, NW68. As you can see, it's also on the Shingles Bank. And again, close to the edge of the modern Needles Channel in shallow water, as you can see from this multi-beam sonar image. Again, the blue colors are deeper and show the channel, the warmer colors are shallower. Martin and Dave's initial side scan sonar, thank you Martin and Dave, showed a site about 20 meters by 7 meters with two very prominent large cannons, one obviously made of bronze and a second of iron. There were outlying anomalies, including an Admiralty type anchor about 44 meters away. Martin and Dave actually initially found this, and then by searching in the direction of the shank or shaft of the anchor was pointing in, found the cannons. You'll appreciate that an anchor will tend to be dragged so it's aligned in the direction of the ship it's holding. So that's a time-honored technique of finding a wreck if you're a diver, if you find an anchor. Now, the bronze cannon was highly decorated with dolphin lifting rings and with a worn, and therefore I'm afraid at this point, unidentified coat of arms on the barrel. However, the words Azueras Costa may fake it, and apologies for my appalling Latin pronunciation, was cast into the base ring at the breech end of the gun. You can see that's the end of the gun. The date it was made and the place could have been expected to follow this. So after the word fake it, there would have been the a date and the place where the gun was manufactured. But unfortunately, it was worn away and illegible. Fortunately, however, we know quite a lot about the Costas. They were a notable family of bell and gun founders working from the late 16th to the late 17th centuries in Amsterdam. However, to confuse matters, two of them were called Azueras. The first worked from 1624 until his death in 1661, and one of his guns has been recovered from the wreck of the Stirling Castle that you may know was a large English warship lost on the Goodwin Sands in the 1703 Great Storm, the hurricane. What we can therefore say about this gun is that it is 17th century, was made by a Dutch gun founder, and has typical Dutch decoration, things like cantler sleeves, things like that. Cannot have been made before 1621, so the wreck cannot be earlier. And it is more in common with guns made by the first Azueras, who we call Costa I, than the second. Therefore, we can date the gun probably to 1621 to 1661. How old the gun was when it was lost is not known, and we should remember that bronze cannons could last a long time in service, particularly if they weren't fired very often. Now, although the initial assessment was completed in 2020 and a recommendation to designate the site under the Protection of Wrecks Act was then made, we have been able to revisit the site in late 2021 because Martin and Dave, who continued to dive it, started to report that more wrecked material, including more cannons and some wooden, what appeared to be wooden ship structure, was starting to emerge from the shingle. This was concerning because this suggested, as you can appreciate, that erosion of the shingle seabed was occurring. And this was exposing archaeological material that could then be damaged by the movement of the shingle in the shallow water, particularly during the expected winter storms over the winter 2021 to 22. So a partnership between Martin and Dave, Maritime Archaeology Trust, and ourselves therefore launched a short diving project funded generously, thank you English Heritage, late in the season to record what we found that was at risk. And this is a new and emerging and highly provisional site plan prepared for NW96 based on a full and very good photogrammetry survey that was carried out by Maritime Archaeology Trust specialists as part of the work. What we... right, you'll have to forget the blank slide. Sorry, yeah. Right. Okay, got that sorted. Not quite as I intended, but there we go. That's the hazards of PowerPoint presentations. Forgive me. What we found was very much an emerging shipwreck. The star find was probably this, a new bronze cannon, which was found partially buried. This is particularly interesting gun because it features the royal arms of Philip IV of Spain here on the barrel, with the date 1628, which you can't quite see in this image. Now, the inscription around the base ring bore the partial name of someone called Johannes Sittoff, and the gun had characteristics of a cannon made for land rather than naval service. Now, Sittoff was another notable gun founder who worked not in Amsterdam, but at Malines, forgive my pronunciation, near Brussels. This was in the Spanish or southern Netherlands at the time, modern-day Belgium. And the gun was therefore almost certainly made for Henry Comte de Berg, who was general of the Spanish artillery there from 1628 to 1632. The gun therefore refines the earliest date of loss of the wreck to 1628 or later. Now, the original assessment didn't lead to an identification of the ship, but the discovery of this gun has led to a re-evaluation of the evidence. The original assessment centered around the presence of a Dutch gun, with a 1668 Dutch loss on the needles being suggested by Martin and Dave, although it's unclear that the merchant vessel concerned en route from Bordeaux to the Netherlands, the victim of the storm, would have been large or prestigious enough to have carried large bronze cannons. The position of the anchor associated with the wreck may also have been wrong. Or rather, I should confess, our friendly ordnance expert, international expert, Charles Trollope, suggested it might represent the wreck of one of the Dutch ships captured and brought in after the Battle of Portland between the English and the Dutch in 1653. And Julie Satchell has rightly pointed out that we can't overlook the possibility that this is a later loss from the 18th century, as bronze guns could have remarkably long service histories. Witness the Costa gun that I mentioned that was found on the Stirling Castle in 1703, long after it was manufactured. Now, the presence of a Dutch gun does not, of course, mean that it must be a Dutch ship. Like English guns, Dutch cannons circulated widely through trade and capture. However, the sit-off gun from the Spanish Netherlands throws an additional possibility or spanner into the mix, depending on your perspective. And as suggested by another one of our ordnance expert friends, this time a noted expert on Dutch guns and Low Countries guns, Nico Brink. During the Dutch Wars of Independence against the Spanish in the 16th century, the Spanish were allied to, I should say the 17th century rather, Spanish were allied to, or rather paid for, the support of the notorious privateers of the port city of Dunkirk, who were a plague on basically everyone. Unless the Spanish army gun was captured, it's possible that what we have at NW68 is not a Dutch or an English wreck, but the wreck of one of the iconic Dunkirk privateers. At the moment, however, the evidence is simply not strong enough to support an identification, so I'd simply invite you to pick your own favourite theory, English, Dutch, Dunkirker, or something else. Well, what of the future? Well, investigation of both sites is likely to continue hopefully as a volunteer professional partnership led by Martin and Dave. Erosion is a big concern, particularly if climate change causes, I don't want to over-egg that, but if climate change causes more frequent winter storms over such very shallow sites. Emergency recording the ship structure that emerges from the shingle is likely to be required, and the image shows a partially buried fragment of closely spaced hull planking and framing with wooden but not metal nails. That's Maritime Archaeology Trust photogrammetry model seen from plan view, and further recording with on the right a drawing that I did from it. Its emergency recording is also likely to be required of soft metal objects that are going to be abraded by the shingles, such as emerging bronze cannons and indeed lead ingots with fragile stamps on them. Here's a lead roll, which I would class as potentially vulnerable. Now, both sites also have vulnerability in terms of the fact that they obviously have valuable materials on them. Bronze cannons have a known high financial value and can be very vulnerable to disturbance and illicit salvage by unscrupulous divers or salvors or errant fishing boats, or a combination of both. And the lead of the ingots of NW96 have a potentially high value to the electronics industry as so-called low background metal smelted prior to widespread emissions from nuclear testing and power generation. That metal is used for equipment and environments sensitive to radiation, such as for microchips. And these vulnerabilities associated with value and potential removal for salvage were the principal reason for treating both sites as confidential until they could be designated. And it's taken a while and has been quite frustrating that we've had to wait, but of course there have been extenuating circumstances. Now, the future will include the completion of the emergency recording begun in 2022, and hopefully the preparation of online virtual dive trails by the Maritime Archaeology Trust. And there's going to be further recording required of more vulnerable objects, including particularly the bronze guns and things like the lead rolls. The future, therefore, will include the completion of the emergency recording in 2023, and the completion of the very successful photogrammetry data capture, this time for both sites, and possibly also the repeating of data capture from 2021, so that we can have comparative data sets and therefore some really hard evidence beyond diver observations about erosion. So watch out for those, hopefully later in 2022 or very early in 2023. So thank you very much.